In the history of human wealth, there is a moment that should have guaranteed China eternal dominance. While Europe was still weighing silver on scales and clipping coins in back rooms, China solved money. It replaced heavy metal with light paper. It created a system where value could travel faster than caravans and safer than ships. It looked like the future. And for a time, it worked so well that the Chinese economy became the most advanced on Earth. But this invention carried a hidden danger, because paper does not rust, does not run out, and it does not resist being created. What began as the greatest financial innovation of the medieval world would become the weapon that destroyed the state that invented it. To understand how this happened, we have to start in China 1,000 years ago, in a world that is rich, crowded, and commercially alive. By the 11th century, the Song Dynasty rules over a population larger than all of Europe combined. Cities stretch for miles. Markets run day and night. Rivers carry grain, silk, and iron between provinces. This is not a feudal economy. It is a trading civilization, and trade needs money. The old system was built on copper coins, small round discs with square holes, strung together in heavy chains. They worked when the economy was small. But as commerce expanded, the metal supply could not keep up. Mines could not produce enough copper to satisfy demand. Taxes were paid in coin. Soldiers were paid in coin. Merchants needed coin. The economy was growing faster than the metal beneath it. Moving money became a problem. A merchant traveling between cities had to haul sacks of metal. Bandits did not need to steal goods. They stole currency. The state faced an even bigger danger. Coin shortages could freeze markets. If money disappeared, trade died, so the Song state did something radical. It allowed merchants to deposit their heavy coins in secure storehouses and receive paper certificates in return. These notes could be traded instead of metal. At first, they were just receipts, promises to redeem coin later. But over time, the government took control of the system. It standardized the notes. It printed them officially. And it declared that they could be used to pay taxes. This was the crucial move. Because once the state accepts something for taxes, it becomes money. At first, the system was disciplined. Paper notes were issued in limited quantities. They were backed by real reserves of metal. The state promised that notes could be exchanged for coin at fixed rates. Officials monitored printing. Counterfeiting was punished harshly. Trust was protected like a military asset. And the results were spectacular. Markets expanded. Long-distance trade exploded. The government could move resources across provinces without hauling wagons of metal. The money supply finally matched the size of the economy. For a time, paper solved the copper problem. China had invented a financial machine that Europe would not build for another 600 years. But every machine has a weak point. The weak point of paper money is not technical, it is political, because metal resists rulers. Paper obeys them. As the Song state grew richer, it also grew more vulnerable. Its northern borders faced constant pressure from rival kingdoms. Armies had to be paid. Fortifications built. Grain shipped to frontier garrisons. War did not just consume lives, it consumed money. And war arrives faster than taxes. Raising taxes meant risking revolt. Selling assets meant weakening the state. Borrowing from elites meant losing independence. But printing paper required only ink and seals. At first, the government told itself the increase was temporary. More notes would be issued now. They would be withdrawn later. The wars would end. Revenues would recover. Trust would remain. But war has a habit of lasting longer than budgets. As military costs rose, paper issues grew. Convertibility was quietly restricted. Notes were renewed instead of redeemed. The backing became symbolic rather than real. The system that once reflected the economy began to replace it. Merchants noticed first. Prices crept upward. A bolt of cloth that once cost a handful of notes now required a bundle. Goods cost more notes than before. This did not look like disaster. It looked like inconvenience, and the state responded the only way a paper system allows. It printed more notes so wages and taxes could keep up. This stabilized the surface. But beneath it, the feedback loop began to form. More notes meant higher prices. Higher prices meant higher costs. Higher costs meant more notes. The danger was not inflation alone. It was belief. Paper money does not circulate because it is useful. It circulates because people expect others to accept it tomorrow. As long as soldiers took notes as pay, as long as farmers accepted them for grain, as long as taxes were settled in paper, the illusion of value survived. That illusion depended on the state's credibility. Credibility is a finite resource. When the Song dynasty fell to foreign conquest in the 13th century, the paper system did not die with it. It was inherited. The Mongol rulers who replaced it saw the machine and understood its power. They ruled a vast empire with enormous military costs and weak tax collection. Paper offered an answer. They expanded it. Under the Yuan Dynasty, notes were no longer a supplement to metal. They became compulsory. Copper and silver were driven out of circulation. Paper was declared the only legal money. The state no longer promised redemption. It promised obedience. And that was the moment the invention turned into a trap. Because once paper is no longer backed by metal and no longer limited by law, it is backed only by force. And force is expensive. It must be paid. In paper. The Chinese state had created a currency that could not restrain the state itself. It had built a system that worked only as long as rulers refused to abuse it. And rulers under pressure rarely refuse the tools that keep them alive. Under the Song, paper had been a tool of trade. Under the Yuan, it became a tool of survival. The miracle of money had become a lever, and the empire had placed its full weight on it. What happens next is not a battle. It is not an invasion. It is the slow destruction of value itself. When money fails, the state loses its ability to act. Once the printing press became a tool of survival, restraint disappeared. The Yuan government did not set out to destroy its currency. It set out to solve immediate problems. Armies needed to be fed. Officials needed to be paid. Transport networks needed to be repaired after years of war. But the empire was stretched across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Tax collection was uneven. Rebellion simmered at the edges. Real revenue arrived slowly. Paper arrived instantly. So the presses ran. At first, the new notes looked like the old ones. They carried imperial seals and solemn warnings against forgery. They promised stability, but they no longer promised metal. The state had severed the anchor that tied money to something physical. From that moment on, money was no longer a measure of value. It was a decree. The logic seemed sound. If the state could force everyone to accept paper, then paper would be worth something. Soldiers were ordered to take it as pay. Merchants were ordered to accept it in markets. Taxes were demanded in notes. Refusing paper became a crime. The economy was not asked whether it trusted the new money. It was commanded to. But markets are not ruled by law alone. They are ruled by expectation. The supply of notes expanded faster than the supply of goods. Grain still took a year to grow. Cloth still took time to weave. Iron still had to be mined and smelted. But money could be created in days. The balance between production and payment began to break. Prices rose. First, the government blamed merchants. Accusations of hoarding spread. Price controls were imposed. Officials inspected warehouses and punished traders who charged excessive amounts of paper for food. But the cause was not greed. It was arithmetic. More paper was chasing the same bowls of rice. Soldiers felt it next. Their wages bought less each season. A sack of grain that once cost a handful of notes now required a bundle. The state responded the only way it could. It raised nominal pay. And to raise pay, it printed more notes. This was the trap. Every solution fed the problem it tried to cure. More printing raised prices. Higher prices demanded higher wages. Higher wages demanded more printing. The currency no longer served trade. It served the bureaucracy that issued it. Merchants adapted. They began to demand payment in goods rather than notes. Grain for cloth, silk for tools. Private barter networks returned. Silver and copper were hidden and traded quietly despite bans. The official money stayed in circulation because it was required. Real money moved underground because it was trusted. Counterfeiting exploded. When a currency is valuable, forgery is risky. When it is cheap, forgery is rational. Local workshops began to copy imperial notes. Officials themselves were caught running presses. The state cannot protect the scarcity of its own money. it loses the only thing that makes money work. The paper flood accelerated. New issues replaced old ones. Old notes were recalled and exchanged at worse rates. Each reform promised stability. Each reform destroyed it further. People learned that holding paper was dangerous. Value had to be spent immediately before it decayed. This is how hyperinflation feels before it has a name. Markets became chaotic. Farmers refused to sell grain for notes that would lose value before the next harvest. Cities faced shortages. Transport broke down because carriers demanded payment in food rather than paper. The state's own tax collectors could not convert revenue into supplies. Money had become noise. The Yuan rulers still controlled armies. They still commanded officials. They still issued laws. But they no longer controlled exchange. Exchange is what turns power into food, steel, and loyalty. Without stable money, the empire had to rely on force alone. Forced requisitions replaced purchases. Grain was seized instead of bought. Labor was demanded instead of hired. What had begun as a financial shortcut turned into coercion. That is when belief finally collapsed. Paper money only works when people think it will work tomorrow. The moment that belief dies, no decree can revive it. The note becomes just ink and fiber. The seal becomes decoration. The promise becomes theater. By the mid-14th century, the yuan currency had lost most of its purchasing power. Tax receipts were meaningless. Military pay was symbolic. Corruption spread because officials were paid in trash. Rebellions multiplied because the state could no longer provision its own forces without plunder. This was not just an economic failure. It was an administrative failure. The empire had built a system where loyalty was paid in paper. When paper failed, loyalty failed with it. The Mongol state still possessed territory. It still possessed laws. But it no longer possessed trust. And without trust, even the largest empire becomes fragile. What followed was not immediate collapse. It was erosion. Local governors became independent. Militias formed. Peasant movements rose in areas where taxes were demanded in worthless notes. The countryside drifted out of imperial control not because of invasion, but because money could no longer connect center to province. The invention that once unified China's economy now fractured it. Paper had allowed value to travel without metal. It allowed authority to dissolve without war. The trap had closed. The question was no longer whether the currency would survive. It was whether the state built on it could. The answer would be written not in ink, but in rebellion. When rebellion finally erupted, it did not begin as an ideological revolt. It began as an accounting problem. Villages could not meet tax demands because the paper they were. Payden could not buy food. Garrisons could not be supplied because transporters refused worthless notes. Provincial officials stopped forwarding revenue because there was no value left to forward. The empire still existed on maps, but its economy no longer existed in practice. The Red Turban rebellions of the 1350s did not start with a manifesto against paper money. They started with hunger, debt, and broken markets. Peasants who once sold grain for stable prices now saw their labor dissolve into ash. Soldiers deserted because wages could no longer feed families. Tax collectors were attacked not as symbols of tyranny, but as carriers of meaningless currency. By this point, the Yuan state had lost the one thing that allowed it to rule a vast territory, the ability to convert command into supply. Armies can fight without ideology. They cannot fight without food. The court tried one last time to restore control. New currencies were announced. Old ones were canceled. Exchange rates were reset. Severe penalties were declared for refusal to accept official money. But every reform confirmed what people already knew. Value is being manufactured, not earned. Once a population learns that money will be replaced tomorrow, it stops believing in it today. Trade collapsed into survival exchange. Grain was hidden, metal was buried, barter replaced markets. Regions became isolated from one another not by walls, but by mistrust. The empire's circulation system, its arteries of exchange, clogged and failed. The Yuan rulers still commanded banners and decrees, but banners do not plant rice. Decrees do not move grain. In 1368, the Ming armies entered the capital. The fall of the Yuan Dynasty was recorded as a military defeat. But the empire had already been weakened years earlier in the currency system. The state collapsed not because it was conquered, but because it could no longer pay. What had once been the most advanced monetary system on Earth had ended as a warning. China had invented paper money to solve a shortage of metal. It ended by destroying trust itself. The lesson was learned. For centuries afterward, Chinese governments treated paper currency with fear. Silver returned, metal returned, memory returned. The trauma of collapse was embedded into policy. But the invention did not disappear. It traveled. Centuries later, Europe would build its own paper systems. Banks would issue notes. States would issue debt. Wars would again be financed not by treasure, but by promises. The same logic would return under new names. Printing does not create wealth. It redistributes belief in who will be paid tomorrow. When belief is stable, paper behaves like metal. When belief is shaken, paper behaves like smoke. The Song and Yuan dynasties discovered this before anyone else because they reached the future first. They learned that money is not a substance. It is a contract enforced by authority and sustained by restraint. Remove restraint, and authority consumes its own foundation. Every paper system contains a temptation. To replace revenue with ink, to replace taxation with decree, to replace value with volume, that temptation is strongest in crisis. War, famine, disaster, moments when survival feels more urgent than credibility. But money does not forget abuse. It records it silently in prices. The fall of China's first paper empire shows that collapse does not need invasion. It only needs miscounted promises. When a state uses money as a weapon against time, it trades tomorrow for today. And when tomorrow arrives, it arrives empty. Paper made China rich. Paper made China powerful. Paper also taught China the cost of pretending value can be printed. The invention that once unified the empire had unmade it. Not through fire, not through siege, but through erosion. The world still lives inside that lesson. Because every modern currency rests on the same fragile rule: trust first, quantity second. And when those are reversed, the future is spent before it is earned. Empires do not fall when they run out of soldiers. They fall when they run out of money that works. China learned that lesson first.